and everything that we do. I think it's most appropriate that we start off ourselves in a good way. You know, the things that we'll be talking about, the people that are here, you know, the energy that we're sharing. And, you know, so it's important that we never overstep that spirit. And so thank you, Ishbel, for asking me to come and share a quick little song, you know, just to set the tone, put out our purest intentions for our evening. So with that, I'll just give a little song, and I'm trying to think of one. You know, this song, like, it's the Eagle song, and I believe I've shared it in the past as well. And this one is just like, we have that belief, right, that, you know, the eagles is he who flies the highest. So I'm asking that our relative may take our collective prayers and, you know, bring them to the heavens, bring them to our creator or whoever that we entrust in with that spirit. So with that, I'll share. Muzikiskuukna medawinto Bechikanu ajuya kitpuna Bechikanu ajuya kitpuna Yo-ho, yo-ho, yo-hande. Yo-ho, yo-ho, yo-hande. Hey, Muzikiskuukna na medawinto. Gkiskedtanamoogk Rosalie Gkiskedtanamoogk. Thank y'all. And as well, I'm just reading that on Isabel's her notes, so that this is going to be recorded as well, and I believe it'll be streamed live to it will not be streamed live, excuse me. It will be reposted again on the Facebook page. And with that, so we're going to be starting off our session, and I'm really pleased to introduce you know, I think I've known this individual for as long as I can remember. You know, we're very much good friends with Gkiskedtanamoogk's partner, and I think that this, you know, these people have been much like family to us, and so I love listening and, you know, watching Gkiskedtanamoogk, you know, in whatever he has to do in his presentations or anything like that. And so, without further ado, I will now pass off to Gkiskedtanamoogk for his presentation.
Good. Well, you know, it just so happens that all this time with perfect condition, and I come down with a cold. Would you imagine that? So please excuse the periodic coughs from time to time. And before I begin, and I'm really going to try to keep this within a half hour if I can. But I want to take the time to state publicly how honored I am to share this space with Sherry, Migamahan, and I have such a deep, fond respect for Sherry and the integrity and the courage that she's shown over the years to speak to the truth. And so I'm really so happy to be here with her. And that goes with Rosalie and Ish. I must have said something right in the past for Ish to extend this invitation to speak on the matter of treaties, and I did a presentation some time ago on Treaties 101, just kind of an introduction. And I do want to state at this is what I know, this is what I understand, and how we live our lives to this, you know. And so I'm really hoping that this has some meaning for all of you who have gathered to this. So if there's anything that from this presentation that I want you to take with you, it's about that if I could be so bold to reduce all the sum total of our experience as Indigenous peoples to one word, it would be relationships. And I don't believe that we started off with the understanding of making treaties, but they were really sincere, deep, intimate connections with all of life around us, right from the beginning of creation for us. So having this relationship with the sacred, with creation, with one another, with other Indigenous nations, and then we extended that relationship and that formality to the people who have come here, the settler and nation states that have come here. So it's like the life before well, let me put it this way. Life in 1491 was extended to life to 1492 and beyond. And I believe that relationships is the fundamental, I guess, reality of life on Turtle Island, and we extend that to everybody in the world. So if there's anything that you can remember from this presentation, it's that. It's all about relationships. And before I forget that I offer this PowerPoint to anybody who would like to have it. I have a document that that narrates some of the points that I'm going to make, and I would have that accessible as well. I want to start with this. I kind of lifted it just from a Mi'kmaq glyph, but it speaks to me really deeply about the nature of life and the fundamental aspects of how life and consciousness and existence had come into being. So even before there was anything, universes, anything, you know, cosmos, earth, creation, there was this time that preceded times before. A great awakening, an awakening that's always been there, awakening that will always be there, kind of thing. And so this petroglyph really speaks to that. I've been a student of understanding the nature of consciousness and how consciousness informs existence and how existence defines consciousness. And I've been studying this for about 5-6 years now. And I'm doing some writing on those bases, particularly in the idea of what does my culture, what does our relationship to the sacred speak to consciousness and existence. Probably right at the time of our birth, our coming into this dimension, we were given this this wondrous gift since the time of creation, and now it's still working from our experience. And I want to just take this moment to share with you that the word tobacco is actually indigenous, it's Taino. The Taino and the Arawak and the Carib are the ones who encountered Columbus back in 1492. And most of, if I can be so bold to say that all cultures throughout North, Central, and South America, Indian country, Turtle Island, have an understanding about Watamog, or Dimawi, the tobacco. And when we use it accordingly, it is a covenant between live here, what the nature of life was here at that time. And we were gifted with tobacco, with Watamog. And for those of us who struggle to pay attention to the movements and the processes around us, understand the significance of tobacco even to this day. And I just wanted to say that this is a picture of, excuse me there, the late Donald Marshall. And Donald, in his life, probably never thought that, you know, he would serve so important and so a high profile in his life. And it speaks to any one of us. We never know what's around the corner. We never know how far our words go. So it really kind of boils down to paying attention to our words and what we do and how we live our lives, and how that can influence the people around us, especially the little ones. And the sincerity about how important our relationship is to the sacred and to creation, to the life around us, is illustrated in this picture of this young woman, Autumn Pelletier. And she is such a profound character, such a profound personality among her peoples, that she is regarded as the chief water bearer. And it testifies that, you know, to the extent of how serious the nature is of our relationship. And when I see this picture, and when I think about people like Autumn, I feel really good that our generation must be doing something right to inspire the next generations coming behind us. So to begin this process about treaties, as you see, the view from the shore is the entire Western Hemisphere. And in 1491, we have come to understand that life is so sacred. And we've gone through the whole menagerie of human experiences. You know, from the perverse to understanding the real rudiments of sacredness of life. So we had all these experiences prior to 1492. Much of this hemisphere was in some form of a confederacy. Confederacy to Indian country is separate nations bonding together by choice. When we do that, we eliminate the ideology of war between us, and that we assume the mantle of family, extending our relationships to one another. And this existed principally all throughout the Americas. And that the life in the Americas prior to 1492 was very dynamic. We knew about each other. We weren't home-based into our communities, and there were no particular political demarcations. We did a lot of traveling in major trading centers all throughout North America. We knew about the people in Mexico, the use of wampum, which is pretty much an Eastern coastal experience, was being used on the plains, you know, as an indicator that we were much traveled, and there was a lot of visitation and a lot of making relationships with each other, you know. And so we're coming from the viewpoint of the shore comes these new people. And it's, you know, when we kind of look at the layout of the globe, the entire hemisphere was populated by indigenous peoples. And that says something about what was going on in the rest of the world, in Europe and Africa and Asia, was eventually brought here to the Americas. So we're always going to have these two solitudes, the view from the shore, the nations of the Western Hemisphere, and the whole world that has come here. And in saying that, I think that we have a wondrous opportunity to change the direction of humanity right here in our own homelands with each other. You know, so the prospects of reconciliation is so very profoundly illuminating in my heart, in my mind, that I feel really good about the potential and the possibilities. From this moment, you know, these two particular statements is a restatement of our commitment to life with the sacred, life with each other. And, you know, we don't know the timeline about when we arrived, when we were birthed into this existence at the time of the giants. But Canada and the United States have only been here for a short time. And they've come here to Indian country. And in coming here, we sought to extend our relationship to each other and our relationship to the sacred. We don't live in Canada or the United States. And by making those early agreements and acknowledgements, we provided a place for the newcomers to come and to settle among us and to live with us. And I think our future, if I can be so bold to say this, is that we need to retrace those steps. We need to because we haven't quite done that yet. And we have this amazing legacy of hostility and confrontation and fear. You know, in order to change all that I think that at some point we can do this. We can find the way and the mechanisms of living in right relationships to each other. And many of us are doing that, doing our best to achieve that goal. The significance of treaty protocol, and I think this is really important to me. You know, it almost doesn't matter what the treaties say. It matters that the treaties exist, and the existence of treaties create a relationship, a nation-to-nation relationship. And it's not about assuming authority or jurisdiction, and unless there's some significant agreement to that effect. A significant treaty to that effect. Otherwise, we are in a nation-to-nation relationship, and that's the protocol. The protocol between us as nations, the protocol between us as people. The top two, actually, let me begin with the images of what you see. The United States, I believe in 1995, the Congress, both the House and Senate, passed a joint resolution recognizing the contributions of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy in the development of the United States, and particularly in the development of the Constitution. Preceding those images, the top image is considered the covenant belt between the Mi'kmaq in the Church of Rome in 1610. At some point, this belt was extended to the rest of and adopted by the rest of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And this belt was used in formality with France as well as with the Crown, the British. Beneath that is the Truro Wampum Belt, a Haudenosaunee relationship with the Netherlands or the Dutch at the time. And it speaks that we travel the river of life together. Europeans in their ship, Indian country in their canoe. And there are 3 rows that separate those 2 dark lines, and they represent peace, friendship, and respect. And when we hold to those principles, then we can have peace between us. But once we begin to transcend those principles, then we have conflict. Below that is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Belt. Below that is the Wabanaki Confederacy Belt. And below that is the peace and friendship that it exists now between the Haudenosaunee and the Wabanaki Confederacy. So we've been, and these last 3 belts predate the top 2 belts. What we see depicted here is the use of the sacred pipe. This is in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to is how serious this ceremony is. This pipe was shared with the Peace Commission of the United States, who was establishing this treaty with the Lakota and the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. But as you can see, how sacred this event is by the way that the people are carrying themselves, you know. And like the wampum, what the sacred pipe did is that it brought the sacred into this agreement. So we're not talking about these treaties as being some political, legal maneuvering, if you will. I can't think of a better word, but it actually made this agreement sacred. We brought the sacred into this. And as understanding the meaning of unceded territory, the Lakota and the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, many of the Plains people who entered into treaties with the United States and Canada, this applies to Canada as well, shared the bulk of their territories, but reserved territories for themselves, unceded territories. And it's surprising that all of us are so quick to recognize the political boundaries of states and provinces and the political territories of Canada, but we never see the unceded territories or the treaty lands of Indian country. And I've been thinking about devising some kind of a project that it can supersede treaty lands on the Rand McNally Road Atlas and the North American maps of the United States and Canada, because when we see where the treaty lands are, where the unceded territories are, then we're not talking about unobstructed United States territory or Canada. The lands of Canada and the United States will turn out to be quite different, and the map would be quite different. And by the way, that we're talking about law. We're talking about a legal political foundation of law. Legitimacy is a term that the late Seneca Professor John Mohawk introduced to us in the meeting. And I had thought about this for a long time, and it's so clear that if the United States and Canada acts with any kind of integrity in their relationship, their nation-to-nation treaty relationship with Indian country, then there's a legitimate presence for them here. But by and large, they don't. You know, and so when we talk about reconciliation, we have to really, it's not about a relationship that we have yet to have. It's about acknowledging the legacy of not abiding by the treaties, not abiding by the relationship that we've had. And at this point, the settler colonial states of Canada and the United States there's a question of legitimacy. Are they here legitimately, kind of thing. And the importance of colonialism, Alicia Cox had mentioned this, and I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind. That we don't necessarily need to experience mass killings to understand the nature of genocide. When genocide becomes a federal policy, irrespective of the treaties, irrespective of nation to nation, but creating conditions that lead to the end of Indigenous peoples, that is an ongoing policy. That's what's happening right now, kind of thing. And it's really important that we acknowledge that, for most of us who are untouched by history, who are untouched by the legacies with Indian country, to us, our normal routine is to get up, go to work, or, have a job to pay for food and so forth. We don't think about the deeper meaning about our relationship to the land and where we are in that sense. And I think it's really important that that's not normal. It's not normal for Indigenous peoples to have to suffer the consequences of not having an army to go to war with Canada and the United States, that we have to use our reason, our heart, and our minds to find a way that we can live here in the kind of fundamental peace, in the fundamental respect and friendship that that we really still rely upon. And it's interesting that in this particular picture, you see the entire most of the Western Hemisphere, Australia and New Zealand, are the last vestiges of settler colonial nation states. And Jessica Clark reminds us that the life of colonialism is still pretty much embedded in the way that Canada relates to First Nations peoples, Métis and Inuit. And to remind us all that, as I was mentioning before, you don't have to go out and mass murder everybody. You just create the conditions. And when this is a policy, this is the intent. And Canada and the United States have violated every one of those conditions. That is the premise of what genocide is. And to remind us that, what I'm talking about is embedded law. If I recall elders once saying that our resolve is for Canada and the United States simply to obey their own law. If they do that, then we're well on our way to rectifying a lot of these unfinished business, these long-standing issues between us. Each of these three particulars are really important to understand, because the Royal Proclamation, as it's embedded in Section 25, really defines the full scope of inherent rights of Indigenous peoples in the treaties. And as a reminder, in Section 52, federal legislation, provincial, state laws, they all have to be consistent. And in this case, they have to be consistent with the treaties and with inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. And when they're not, like the Indian Act, like the Immigration Act, and like so many other acts, citizenship, and what they're not consistent with the Constitution, then they're of no force, no effect, no impact. The Royal Proclamation was formulated in October of 1763. And it's interesting to note that when this was promoted and shared with the colonies, the Crown took it upon themselves to introduce this idea to the Indigenous nations that we've already had a relationship, treaties with. And they called this conference in Niagara in the summer of 1764. 2,000 representatives of Indian nations gathered at that with the Crown, and from the East Coast to the prairies. the Indian representatives brought with them to the Truro Wampum Belt to remind the Crown of the exact nature of our relationship. The Crown actually provided that wampum to the nations who are gathered. And this Treaty of Niagara was based on the Truro Wampum Belt, and the Royal Proclamation is based on these belts, on the Truro in the Treaty of Niagara. So we're talking, this is where we get the nation to nation and unceded territories in Canadian law. And it's my position that if you take away the Indian Act, what we have left are the treaties. The Indian Act and other federal pieces of legislation actually undermine the treaty relationship. And it provides an excuse for Canada to not honor the treaties, to not even think about the treaties. Oh yeah, we might say nation to nation, but what's really being lived out are the manipulative, controlling, posturing of Indian affairs in Canada to Indian nations and to the lack of respecting the treaties, enforcing the treaties, kind of thing. In the TRC, 94 calls, as an effort to move forward the necessity of binding relationships, and they're calling for a royal proclamation on the basis of reconciliation that would be built on the Royal Proclamation, the Treaty of Niagara, a very good step in the right direction. Believe it or not, the United Nations did a treaty study of Indigenous treaties, basically a 10-year study. And what they found in that 10-year study was that the position of Canada and the United States claimed that Indigenous peoples are not really peoples for the sake of international law, and that these are not really treaties in the sake of international law. And the courts had confirmed that Indigenous treaties are a domestic issue and not an international issue. And of course, we disagree. And as a footnote to that, the integrity of treaty relationships follow that we enter into these relationships with our free consent, expecting a good faith enactment of these, and that we can't use force or duress as a way of entering into these treaties. And that, Canada and the United States often use the term of change conditions or appeal to domestic law as a way of not following the binding relationship to the treaties. And according to treaty law, that does not, that violates the treaties. One thing, in fact, what you see here right under the title of the treaties is a way that you can actually access this treaty study. And I was really moved by this top statement about that we really have to acknowledge the current situations that create such a desperate scenario for Indian peoples, and that historical justice, we're not talking about going back to and righting all those wrongs. What we're talking about, that those wrongs are based on what's happening today. And this is what we have to face. We have to together, we have to find resolve, adequate resolve to this. Oh, my time is up, apparently. So I'll leave it at that, but I'll let, also to remind you that this PowerPoint is available to you, as well as a narrative. And I'll bring this back to Rosalie.
Oh, well, Gkiskedtanamoogk, my brain was just like blown. Like I was sitting there and it's just like, so much good information. That's why I'm so happy that this is being recorded. So I could definitely go back. So if there's any questions at this time, please save them. As I'm going to now introduce a relative of mine. It was just so nice, Sherry. I went back to, I was down in Digby in the fall time, and that was my first time being, in our territory, there, our homelands. That one of my relatives comes from Bear River as well, and so just being there to connect once again, it felt like it was like realizing it's like, wow, like my great grandfather would have, he would have been on here, he would have seen this, like this is what he would have waken up to every day. So I'm just really happy to share this space with my relative of mine, and she's done amazing work, and I'm so happy to now present Sherry.
Thank you, Rosalie. Just give me a moment to set up. So everybody can see that. It might be a little bit too big. I should maybe keep it slow. Well, we'll just go with it. Yeah, thank you. I'm so honored to be here as well. I was thinking, as Gkiskedtanamoogk was speaking, I've known him and his care and his willingness to share in such a good way for many years now. And of course, I've known his partner for many years, and she continues to inspire me. And Rosalie, I'm just so honored. I traveled to New Zealand here, I think it was in 2018 now. There was Rosalie. And she's speaking about our relatives. Yeah, we're interrelated. I knew her grandmother quite well. And in fact, when I was sort of a young rebellious person, I used to sit by her grandmother at meetings just to kind of keep me centered. But her grandmother was no pushover either, because there was times she would make me get up and speak. Sherry, you got to get up and speak. So anyways, it's just lovely to be here. And so I'm going to talk about the peace and friendship treaties, and I think it's going to overlap a little bit and really try to speak about this from, lack of better term, an Indigenous feminist or a gender perspective. If I can go on here now. Okay, so yeah, here are some of our peace and friendship treaties, and they're all interrelated. And my work focuses on like what was the spirit between these words, because as we know, there's interpreters and so forth. But one of the fundamental things in the statements in the 1752 treaty that really speaks to what we just heard about this concept of our relations and it being intergenerational is in the 1752 Peace and Friendship Treaty, like members and delegates of the said tribe for themselves and their said tribe and their hearers and their hearers of their hearers forever. It's such an important concept I found. And when we talk about peace and friendship treaties here in the East, amongst the Wabanaki peoples, including my own people, the Mi'kmaq people in Mi'kmaq, those are exactly what they were, peace and friendship treaties, to live in peaceful coexistence. And I just finished reading some aspects of Bill Wickens' book, Decolonizing Mi'kmaq Memory, and I may come back to him, where he did a lot of in-depth research and about particularly on the what was recorded, albeit it was from a European perspective, of the first meetings of the Mi'kmaq people. And of course, you will see in those readings that the Mi'kmaq people gave everything they had. They would give everything they have, and actually they would leave naked, because they would give these, and it just goes to show how, we were a sharing people. Oh, there we go. And so a lot of my work centers on, like, because of the things that Gkiskedtanamoogk talked about of how Canada, particularly here in Northern Turtle Island, has really, you know, ignored its obligations, in fact, used the Indian Act to oppress people and so forth. And the way that, and I'll come back to this way, the treaties are being interpreted now is that you know, a very good friend of mine, who many of you may know, is the former chief Carrie Prosper of Wabanaki. And I remember we were talking about some of the Mi'kmaq concepts and language, and I'm by all means not a speaker. And he was talking about, you know, what was our mindset? What would have been in our language? What would have been, you know, how, you know, that in our thinking of making these treaties? And we did have concepts of making relations. And one of the fundamental differences, though, this included all of our relatives, all of creation, all of life. So our tree and all of that was our relatives. And I love this quote that I took from Trudy Sable and Bernie Francis, our Mi'kmaq linguist, Bernie Francis. You know, personal and reciprocal relationships extended to the animals and other objects considered inanimate in Western worldview, such as rocks, mountains, certain stages of the production. Oh, somebody's turned this off. I told them that I was busy and they still text me. But anyways, a certain production of the wood products, winds, weather, and so forth. So it's a very, like, our understandings of, and I'll come back here to treaty, of making relations is very broad. And, you know, some of this, you know, we can say that was lost. And to make a long story short, this is what my thesis work was on. I was an old woman that went back to school, and I was really interested of what my own people thought of treaties and what treaties were, as opposed to the rhetoric we were hearing in the political circles and policy circles. And basically, I won't go through all this, but just that bottom quote, these understandings are relational and include a responsibility to families and communities, to loved ones and ancestors in the spirit world, to future generations by attending to the health of the resources and to the natural ecosystems that sustain them. And I think it's just really very important, and what I wanted to mention here as well, even though this was like in 2017, it's important to note that relationship building historically we had concepts of treaties long before the Europeans arrived. We had intertribal understandings. We had all of these different type of understandings in this form of treaty making, but it took into this broader concept of all of life. And Duma Young speaks about this as well. And then this notion of responsibility, you hear Elder Albert Marshall talk about this, like our relationships came a responsibility. And of course, I have the same photo of Donald Marshall Jr. And really, this was we've had a long history of confronting policies, like confronting Indian agents, and of course, our judicial agency that started with Gabriel, well, even before that, but Grand Chief Gabriel Sillaboy, Donald Marshall Jr. And I always try to acknowledge Donald Marshall Jr. because I caught myself saying the Marshall case, the Marshall case, the Marshall case. And it's really important to honor this man and to really acknowledge that he had spent 11 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. He was only 17 years old and tried as an adult. And then he finally gets exonerated from that with the truth 11 years later. And then, of course, he fights for our treaty rights all through the court system. And it's just so really important to honor that. And I knew his dad quite well as a young girl. His father was Grand Chief as well. I want to kind of step ahead to how treaties are being interpreted today. And, you know, there's, of course, we all know about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I will come back to that. And this is happening across Turtle Island in the United States and today known as Canada, that there's been violence on the land and violence on the bodies. And I want to just speak a moment for how those two are interconnected. And basically, I'm hoping I didn't get my slides mixed up here, but basically we know, like we've heard mention of the Indian Act. Well, historically, women have been removed from their communities, or they've been even removed out of existence through the Indian Act for all kinds of reasons that I won't get in here. But there was a lot of gender discrimination. And when we talk about colonialism and settler colonialism, we tend to forget that with that came patriarchy. And that patriarchy infiltrated all our communities, and this male dominance. And it continues to this day, that even, you know, when we talk about the history of the treaty, the women's role was missing through there. And I often think about the late elder Lillian Julian, that talks about, you know, the role that women's kind of played with the Grand Council. And so we have to assume that women played a role as well in the making of those treaties. And in fact, coming back to Bill Wiccan, and I tried to find it today and I couldn't find it, where he went through some of the colonial government notes and so forth. And basically, we have to understand how these treaties were concluded. It wasn't like that they were just made one day. And I know Elder Jane Meader talks about this, that we didn't succumb, you know, to these treaties. These treaties were debated for days and days within the communities. And so, you know, as you know, we have to assume that Indigenous women had a role in that. And so it's just really important. It wasn't like we just signed up one day and signed these treaties. And, you know, there's even some debate who really were the signatory of these treaties, because sometimes Mi'kmaq communities would say, well, who's the best person to represent us? Who's the best person to go and talk on our behalf? So basically, how those treaties are being, unfortunately, being interpreted today in modern times is not as a relationship with the land and water, but as a resource, as a form of colonialism, or it's a form of capitalism, a way of making money. And unfortunately, in a lot of treaty negotiations of how to implement these treaties, this seems to be the only option made available to us. And what I'm trying to get at here is the link is that there's been a hyper resource exploitation within this country, we know. And basically, we know that there is a link to the violence and even the murder of Indigenous women. And this is the infiltration of male workers and so forth. So there is a very uncanny, but not surprisingly, from a Mi'kmaq worldview or an Indigenous worldview, that violence on the land, there's also violence against women's bodies and also gender diverse persons. And this had come out in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Final Inquiry Report. Whoops. And one of the things that was so striking to me was the call upon governments, and in particular Indigenous governments, to ensure that women and gender diverse person had a say in the decision-making process. And why that is so important, in particular Indigenous government, it sort of speaks to how patriarchy has infiltrated, you know, our systems through the Indian Act and so forth. And they also called for gender-based social economic impacts assessments on resource extraction. And so, of course, as many of you in the East would know, we too have had our struggles here. And what's so interesting, it's women that's usually leading these struggles. We have a lot of help from our men, but we have, it seems like they're leading them, and you know, it's against these development. So they're sort of in a catch-22. It's like, it's this resource extraction on one hand, which seems to be the only available mechanism to implement the treaties, and yet they well know our connections to land and water, the essence of water and the land as food and so forth. And so we know, you know, this is the famous photo taken by journalist Ozzie Michelin in the left-hand corner of Amanda Pulchis against the security of the fracking company in Untitled. Here we have a beautiful picture to the right of some of our Mi'kmaq women visiting the Wolastoq women fighting the Sisson mine. And so, you know, it's just really interesting how they're taking up this fight. And it's not easy, because sometimes we have to kind of navigate between not only the government system, mainstream government system, but our own government system. And just to prove the point of how hyper intensive this resource extraction is, though that you've seen the company's security guards there and so forth, and through the law of injunctions and so forth, it's the women that are criminalized. They're criminalized for standing up, even if it's peaceful and so forth. And I could get into all of this, but this would be, you know, another session on its own. And so some of my current research, this is almost complete, it has been looking at the impacts of resource extraction and this contradiction between what the treaty rhetoric is compared to the teachings of our ancestors and so forth. And I invite you all. I've partnered with Kairos, and we will be uploading some digital stories and a report of some of the work there on resource extraction. It's called Mother Earth Resource Extraction, the hub. And where I'm going with this as well, my future work that I'm just on the cusp of, is looking at the roles of gender in Indigenous governance. Ooh, why isn't that going? I can't seem to move my, I don't know why that is. I'm going to just, I seem to be frozen here. I can't seem to move my PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. So I just wanted to point out how intensive this is in terms of how the direction that treaty and land claim negotiation seems to be going. And here are some major contradictions. You know, we have no clean drinking water. The government promised to do this, but of course, this has taken longer, and they're not, you know, we still have a lot of Indigenous communities without adequate cleaning drinking water, and particularly through the pandemic. This has happened through the pandemic. And at the same time, the Site C Dam in British Columbia was approved. They're forging ahead with that particular project. And as we all know, the Site C Dam is a source for fracking water. And then we have, during the pandemic, the pipelines, mine work sites, resource extraction classified as essential services, but yet we have the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's final report being put on hold due to the pandemic. I don't know why this hesitates. I'm sorry for this, and for some reason there's something that stops me from moving ahead. Here we go. Oh, maybe that's it. Maybe I use my space bar here, but and so also just recently the UN, or was this in 2019, still finds that Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by toxic waste, and particularly mercury. We know all about that. And Gkiskedtanamoogk was talking about you know, the domestication of a lot of treaty rights. And although there's there's a lot of talk about recognizing UNDRIP through Bill C-15. There is some concern that that too is being domesticated. And what I get scared about, that's an international document. And for the last few years, we've been hearing, you know, oh, we're going to approve this unconditionally. However, we're going to put a Canadian slant on it, the interpretation. And what scares me about that how do we hold the federal government accountable? And if they don't, if UNDRIP is really limited and if it's not implemented properly, well, then what recourse do we have? And that's what scares me about domesticating that document, and in the sense that will we be able to appeal to, you know, international forums? And of course, we have a new office to probe the human rights complaints against Canadian companies abroad. And this is so important because I think they need to be held accountable at home. And yet they do not have any teeth. This has been one of the major complaints that Kairos and I have. They don't have no enforcement teeth. And this brings me to this really beautiful picture of two incredible women, and we were able to meet the grandmothers and land defenders fighting against Sisson Mine with the Alton gas, and you have Doreen Knockwood there to the left, and you have Ramona Nicholas to the right, and that's our Maliseet or our Willistic women meeting with the Mi'kmaq women. And we were just able to fit that in before the pandemic hit. And Ish will recognize this because this is up in Tatamoogk, and it was really cold, but this was like 7 o'clock in the morning and we were getting up for a water ceremony. And it's through the perseverance and the resurgence of these type of ceremonies and these practices that that I have the most hope of restoring treaty relations to all of our relatives. This is sort of a quick overview of that. And of course, the women of First Light, the Wabanaki women, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that. I can't pronounce it as well as Ishbel does. And this is a group of women that has highly supported me. And they've done everything from tanning moose hides, that we've had longhouse ceremonies, we've had wigwam raising ceremonies, and sharing stories and really supporting one another, reaching out to the youth. And I'm just so proud to be a part of this. And why I raise this is that this, despite of what is happening politically, there is this resurgence of women, and it took me a while to understand that, you know, just do it. And I've learned so much from these incredible women. And in fact, they even supported the 7th District Chief, Gary Metallic, who came out with a really strong statement against some of the settler colonial attitudes, like the rights recognition and rights framework and so forth. And some of the women that I've worked with are moving into this direction. They want to have rights for rivers. They want to explore what would be some of our, you know, unpacking some of the roles that Indigenous women would have played and continue to play in our communities. And that includes, you know, upkeeping those treaty relations and so forth. And so I'm not going to take too much time. I'll end with this beautiful quote that was in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Final Inquiry Report that was launched in June 3rd, 2019. And then 3 weeks later, the pipeline was also announced, which told me that they didn't read the report. And this is the report that is put on hold. But there was a beautiful quote from, it's Donis Kennedy. And she shared, I think one of the first things that I could share is that women are life givers. And from that flows so much. It is women who carry life, women who give life, women are, it is upon women that all life depends. And for the Anishinaabe, I can't pronounce that, that carries many, and for the Anishinaabe, that carries many different consequences. You know, because women are the life givers in our nation. It is the women who carry the water. It is our grandmother, the moon, who governs water. But it is the women who carry the water and who work with the water, who work for the water. And so any decision that impacts the water or impacts life is a decision that requires women. And that's a huge consequence. And that's a huge thing, because that means that any decision that we make will affect life. We must ask women. And I thought that was such an important quote in that report. And I just finished reading about a water research project that a colleague who also is Anishinaabe, Deborah McGregor, and she's with Osgood Law. And she talks about in the 2000s, she worked with the late Josephine Madeline, and she talks about how she learned from the women she was working with that women also speak for the water. And I find this so important because in this all of creation worldview between humans and the non-human worlds, including our ancestors and so forth, this is so important, because who speaks for the fish? Who speaks for the trees? Who speaks for the oceans? Who speaks for the water? Those are our relatives. And this is something that I think that our treaties need to get back to, because they're being hijacked for profit. And not to say that, you know, I always get accused of being anti-development. I'm not anti-development, but I sure as heck don't want to participate in a form of development that underlines where our knowledge comes from. And that's our land and water systems. And we have to find more sustainable ways. So that's what I have to share with you this evening. And I'm sorry if I rushed through that and opening to questions, but thank you so much for listening to me. And it's an honor to be here. Misidnogama, all my relations.
There we go. Walalieg, Sherry, for all that you had shared. You know, it was certainly powerful, and I believe, like, you know, both yourself and Gkiskedtanamoogk's messages and insight really had a lot of that balance, right? You know, from those different perspectives. And, you know, so I'm just really thankful that I got to, you know, sit in during this time and to listen to both of your presentations. And so I have Ishbel in the chat. She has had mentioned, is there any that you could ask any questions in the chat box? Oh, and I see Lorraine Claire has her hand raised, so I'll let her ask her question at this time.
Hi, I'm kind of sitting in the dark right now, but my question is, with the recent events that's happening in Gkiskedtanamoogk with the lobster and everything else, and the treaty truck house, what are your views or your, I guess, your opinions on the I guess it was sort of like a they had a ceremony today, and there was a couple of the elder women there, and Jolene Marr, and they unburied the hatchet. And I just wanted to know, I'm assuming that everyone knows about the burying of the hatchet ceremony when the treaties were done, and by them, by the women doing this today, like, what are your opinions on that, on of them taking that stand?
So either Sherry or Gkiskedtanamoogk, if you had wanted to chime in.
I really would need to learn more about it. I don't know, like, the specifics of what stand they took, but I'm quite aware of what happens at the Treaty House is quite ceremonial a lot of the time. And I need to correct this. Ishbel corrected me in the, and I don't know why that slipped my mind. It's Doreen Bernard, not Doreen Knockwood. And so I don't really know enough about it to really comment on that.
All I can add, this is actually the first time I heard about this too, Lorraine, but going back to what Sherry was pointing out, that when we respond, and we rightfully respond, because the law backs us in this response, that both industry and the governments, be they province or municipals or federal, are really wrong. They're on the wrong side of this, and that they are required by law, by their own constitution, to enforce those treaties. And one of the principles behind those treaties is about consent. And if that's absent, then as Section 52 says, they're on the wrong side of this. And so it takes a lot of courage, for community members to do what they can, to be vigilant. And as was said before, is that, we are, by agreement of our life here, we also have to represent the earth and represent the waters and the fish, so, all I can say, is just to remind us that Canada and the industries are on the wrong side of this issue.
And just on that, I will add that issue of consent is such a big problem. And it's something that I really would like to have addressed, because we've fought all these treaties and had a lot of successful court cases throughout the years. However, there's something that happens when those treaties are interpreted to how they are implemented. And one of the issues is with this consent. There's a combination of the treaties and consent. And I always ask what has happened here, because it seems that corporate law supersedes Indigenous law, or it supersedes treaty law. And what I mean by that is that more and more and more, and we've seen this right across Turtle Island, the government will download the responsibility, the duty to consult, which came out of the Delgamoogk case, the duty to consult on corporations. So when the chiefs enter into these negotiations, they're bound by corporate law to this level of confidentiality, this principle of confidentiality. And I've been in these meetings where it's like, oh, look, you can't talk about this. And this has caused a lot of turmoil in a lot of communities here in the East, because there's no mechanism to consult with your own people. And so a lot of times when women hear about the dangers coming to their ancestral homelands and river systems and food systems and so forth, they are sometimes shocked to find out that their own leadership, either directly or indirectly, just by even affiliation with an organization, have been involved with providing corporations even with exploratory rights or so forth. And that's what I meant. What's so hard, extremely hard for a lot of our women, is that they find themselves not only having to navigate through the settler system, then they have to navigate through their own Indigenous communities. And that's, so there is some courageousness that these women are standing up and it is really interesting to me. But I think that's something like, we have to ask, when did corporate rights supersede treaty rights? When did corporate rights supersede Indigenous rights? And that's the dilemma that we're in.
Thank you for that. If Lorraine, if you have any supplement to that.
Well, I was gonna kind of show you the video of what they did today. It's just a small little, I can kind of have my camera face there if you wanted to, you guys wanted to see it. She's reading the treaty right now. I don't know if you guys will be able to see.
That Indians shall have free liberty to bring for sale to Halifax or any other settlement
too blurry?
in this province.
Yeah.
Feathers, fowl, fish,
Lorraine?
they shall
Yeah.
have-
You have permission to
Where they
share
shall
now.
have
If
the
you have
liberty
that
to-
on a
Okay.
button on your computer, you can share it directly with everybody.
Yeah, I thought it would be able to go through, but I just wanted to show like what they did, like this symbolic. Oops.
Oh, Lorraine, I believe you are muted still.
Yeah, it's all right. It didn't go through. I think what I'll do is I'll just send it to you. Or go on Jolene Marr's live feed. Jolene Marr from Shuby.
Sounds good.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine, for sharing that. It was definitely, that was the first time I heard of that today as well too. So I'm definitely gonna go after and look more into that. But at this time, is there any more questions from our audience? As I was saying, you could put it in the chat and we could kind of, and I'll share that with our panelists, or if you had wanted to raise your hands. There's always like this little silence. Like, any takers?
While we're waiting for the next question, I didn't quite get to finish the presentation, but one of the recommendations that were coming from this UN treaty study was to avail international options to Indigenous peoples, particularly when there is a kind of a malfunctioning of the internal process of Canada and the United States, that there are some international options. And I mean, this study is almost 30 years old, but now there are Indigenous NGOs at the UN, and I think that following the declaration, I think that there is a strong indication that we really need to move to an international tribunal level to begin this rectifying some of these outstanding issues.
Thank you, Gkiskedtanamoogk, for that. I believe I did see somebody who was unmuting themselves, but I just forget who. Is there anybody else who has any questions regarding our past two panelists' presentations? You don't have to be shy.
I'm just wondering if there are any more comments about Bill C-15.
Sherry or Mook, you have anything on C-15?
No, I've been so busy, but it doesn't surprise me that it's a very divisive topic, because there's some organizations and some leadership that's really pushing this because I think it's the only way, but there's also policy analysts and so forth saying, well, wait a minute, no, this is just reasserting Canada's sovereignty. And as we know, as I just explained, how treaty rights are being interpreted. And that's what scares me. So you know, if it comes under the, you know, solely under the Canadian domain without no international accountability, what scares me is that their interpretation will be what we call in academia this very neoliberal, what I call colonial capitalist interpretation, where mega extraction will be a way to implement the only way to implement your treaty right. And quite frankly, this is what has happened in the fishing industry as well, because we've had 21 years of it, right? And so that would be that's a fear of mine, and a big fear of mine. And again, when it comes from a gender perspective, we've seen how the mega industries were considered an essential service, but this, you know, the recommendations of the missing and murdered Indigenous women were not. So I don't, that's not really a whole lot of insight, but it's sort of a fear of mine.
Yeah, insight. Thanks, Dick, for that that question. The Declaration was designed, when Canada signed off to it. Well, they signed it, changing their negative vote to a positive vote, with the idea that it's aspirational. But the reality is that the Declaration as it stands now is a restatement of what we've already just talked about. It's a restatement of the requirement of fundamental relationships on a nation to nation. It talks about consent. It talks about Indigenous lands, unceded lands. It talks about the treaty enforcement. And I think Sherry mentioned it, that where does corporate law supersede international law and supersede constitutional law? These a replay of very fundamental questions of authority here, and that I'm afraid that the government is not really being honest about this. And if I'm kind of wondering that, there's a really serious question about Indigenous leadership. We're talking about band governments, chief and councils who are an instrument of Canada. They're an instrument of the Indian Act. These are and if we examine the Indian Act, it reduces Indigenous governance to administration aspects of governance, and that it's actually the government of Canada who's calling the shots under the Indian Act. What we're talking about Indigenous governance, we're talking about the present existence of Mi'kmaq original governance. It still exists. We're talking about the people who hold the treaties, and the people who hold the sovereignty that's behind these treaties. Unfortunately, these matters seem to trickle down to community members doing their best to try to address these enigmas of law, or the lack of law, the lack of order, kind of thing. And it shouldn't really be their place, and I'm not being negative about band councils, but it's like Canada is negotiating with itself and not with the treaties, and it's not responding to the treaties here. And so any version of C-15 that is, again, talking about domesticating international law is illegal, in my understanding.
And just to add to that, because and this might partially answer the question from Barbara in the chat, She says, I'm wondering what the history has been with Government of Canada and the Indian Act. Why is it still there if it violates the treaty law? And it's really important to understand that why we're talking about treaty rights, it's because of a long history of struggle and resistance and judicial agency. And it wasn't that, oh, the federal government woke up one day and said, oh, we're going to give treaty rights. We had to fight for those treaty rights. So unfortunately, what we are seeing is that there's everything being done politically to circumvent implementing those treaty rights under any other version but how they are being perceived by the government. And the Indian Act is a catch-22 because this has violated particularly women. It's it is, you know, ironically, in the 1980s, when women were fighting for equality, gender equality in the Indian Act, because we would lose our status if we married non-natives and all, and we had, you know, we couldn't even vote in our own chief and council elections till 1951. But ironically, in the 80s, when they were really lobbying with the, you know, the patriation of the Constitution, it was Indigenous leadership, male leadership, that fought against them, and they used the Indian Act as their source of Indigenous sovereignty. And this is not like, this is why, you know, my good friends would say, this is why both women and men and gender diverse persons need healing from this process. And I forgot to all talk about the whole healing concept, but anyways, that's what happened. And the Indian Act is still there. And it's via through that Indian Act why the negotiations, why the consultations stop at the band elected chiefs, because that's where the chiefs derive their authority, better or worse. And everyone will say, well, why don't you just get rid of the Indian Act? Let's just get rid of it. And I fear for that too, because of the hundreds of years of patriarchy that's been imposed in our communities, that I don't want the Indian Act being replaced with another patriarchal system. So this is where, that's why that Indian Act is so complicated. But there has been talk, and when I see Indigenous organizations agreeing with the government, yes, let's get rid of the Indian Act, I'm saying, yeah, but what are we going to replace it with? That's what we have to be careful of. And just one final point about that Indian Act. It took years and years again of women struggling, judicial agency, and we finally were able to remove the traces of the gender discrimination in the Indian Act in 2019, and it's a victory, and everybody was celebrating. But I said, think about this: 1876 under Confederation, and then you can even go back because it was a combination of federal and colonial laws, and 2019 to remove gender discrimination. Is that something that Canada should be proud of? Think about that, 1876 to 2019. Anyways, I don't think that fully answers why the Indian Act is still there, but it's been contemplated, and I think there's been fear of what would replace it. And as we know, back in 1969, there was what we call the white paper policy, where they were going to just do away with even the existence of Indigenous people and assimilate us as Canadians. And so I think that's why the Indian Act is still around, you know, and it's controversial.
I would just piggyback on that, Jerry, that, you know, again, you remove the Indian Act and what's left are the treaties. You know, what's left is constitutional law, you know. And I've heard, and I agree with this. There's some realities that we have to face, you know, and a lot of these are, at least for community peoples, Indian peoples here, you know, we've got a lot of homework to do among ourselves, you know. And then on the same level, we got to find this I think this magic formula to resolve these kinds of impasses, because whatever Canada's going to do and however they're going to do it, they're going to maintain that paternalistic control. That's the whole design of the Indian Act. What it was doing to the women was by design. What it's doing to our Indigenous governance is by design. It's not Indigenous governance. Canada fights tooth and nail about the application of international law to our treaties and the right of self-determination. This applies to peoples. And Canada fights very hard, as well as the United States, that Indigenous peoples are not peoples under international law, and that's absurd. And we have treaties that demonstrate that we're sovereign peoples. A caveat is that any country in the world, their citizens do not have treaties with their own government. And those treaties are embedded in the Constitution. So what we're talking about here is, and it's unfortunately that that federal courts don't, well, I think sometimes they do remind the government, but federal courts should address the fact that treaties are international instruments. They're not a domestic issue, and they shouldn't even be talked about in the courts unless it's talking about reminding the federal government that they have a national constitutional mandate to observe and to enforce those treaties, which they don't. So in a sense, even the courts are problematic because they're domesticating the treaties, for what it's worth.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. These questions, I believe Dick has answered. He has asked another question in the chat. So would anybody like to comment on the recent naming of the site of the former Wabanaki Indian Residential School as a National Historic Site by the Government of Canada?
Well, I would think that, I would hope that the government of Canada is using this as a monument to the failure of working with and protecting Indigenous children. I believe there was an apology that was made, and that apology was sincere, and this might be a national monument in the same level as the Holocaust monuments, to remind us that this is not a proper relationship. A proper relationship has to be built on peace and mutual respect, a kind of togetherness that our relationship to creation and the sacred would suggest that we have with our Canadian and American relatives. That's the kind of future I think we need to start working with.
Yes, thank you, Gkiskedtanamoogk, for that. I very much do agree, and even just that question kind of got me as well. And as my grandfather had attended that school too, and so just to think of putting those in that same context, right? Of what does that signify? But I'm really thankful for Gkiskedtanamoogk for giving it a different meaning, right? It's not something that Canada should be proud of, that creating this monument. But I do see in our comments, Jane Meter has said our troubles began much further back to the 15th century in 1453 with the Papal Bulls and the Doctrine of Discovery that legitimizes the dehumanization of Indigenous people. So that's a pretty powerful statement as well too. I believe I see that Lorraine's hand is up again.
Speaking on the residential school, like it's been said, it's kind of way of them re-admitting what they did wrong. But with that particular site, because of there right now, there's a plastics factory sitting on it on that land, and to me, like making that site, are they going to make the whole land an historic site, or are they just going to put up a monument? You know what I mean? Because really, in my mind, if they're going to make it a historic site, they need to get that plastics factory out of there, and they need to actually honor the land that's there. And I truly believe that some of our kids are still buried on that land, and that that needs to be honored. Those children need to be honored. And by removing that plant, I mean, I have nothing against, you know, that the people are in it, but I really truly believe that that plant needs to be removed. And, you know, like it's kind of almost a slap in the face to Gkiskedtanamoogk, because of the fact that, speaking of, my dad's family is from there. I'm a Mar. So when I look at it as that site being a historic site, and then just down the road, they have the Treaty Truck House that they've been fighting out in gas. So it's kind of like, you know, we're going to give you this, but we're going to take it away over here. You know, that's just kind of my opinion on that whole situation.
Well, all in Lorraine for that. So, oh, yeah, seeing those comments coming in. So at this time, is there any more questions? Ooh, and we got Ishbel asking Jane if she wants to speak to that.
Not tonight, because one, I'm not prepared and I don't want to take time away from Sherry and Gkiskedtanamoogk. I think what they have to say is really important.
Oh, come on, Jane.
In other words, I'm not letting you two off the hook. That's what
This is ad lib, Jane. No
I
preparation.
learned so much from Jane. She's gave me spirit through this COVID. I think it was last fall. I had the honor of listening to her, and I had to go on a environmental law call or something, and she had me all revved up with her. She knows our the history of our treaties, and that we weren't just these passive people. And so by all means, Jane, don't worry about taking from us. I know you're trying to train us, but by all means.
I'm really just not prepared. But those of you that don't know what the papal bulls are, they began with Pope Gregory. I think it's Pope Gregory the Fifth, or I can't quite remember their names now. But it was a time in Europe when the Christian Church was at war with the Muslims and the Crusades. And one of the big things that the Christian Church at the time, you got to remember, first of all, it's the Christian Church, but it was also, they were all Catholic at that time. And it was, the Pope was the King of Kings. Everybody listened to what the Pope had to say. So they brought out these papal bulls, and the first one was to give English monarchs, or not English, European monarchs, the right to lands, that it was believed that anybody who was not Christian, they called them the enemies of Christ, and that they had no right to lands or to the ownership of any lands. And it was with the Muslims that they were fighting with. That was 1453. Columbus lands on the shores, on our shores, in 1492. And in 1493, there's a second papal bull. There's a series of them up until around 1510 maybe. And the whole series of those papal bulls are dealing with indigenous people. And what they're saying in those papal bulls, that the Europeans could come in, plant a flag, and they can take those lands for themselves because they belong to non-Christians. We were not considered human. And the other thing was, because we were not Christians, they could take our lands and they could try to convert us. And if we chose not to convert, then they would kill our land. They would kill us and the heirs, our people. And also that, first of all, that if France came in and took the land, basically, if France came, claimed the land, then England couldn't come and claim the land for them, because they're taking it from another Christian, a Christian country or Christian kingdom. But they were very cruel to our people. And they read these decrees telling our people they need to convert, and they need to convert to Christianity, but they're written in Latin, a language our people didn't understand. Our people accepted the Europeans, they treated them well, and they gave them everything they could. And the Europeans, I often believe, and I've heard this before from elders, that Europe was bankrupt. Europe was spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally bankrupt. And they came here because Spirit called them. Unfortunately, when they arrived, the greed and the materialism that had almost destroyed Europe took over. And they saw the gold, and they saw the land, and they saw the resources. And so they none of it has actually been legitimized. And our people were dehumanized and demoralized. And please, if you have the opportunity, there is a website called the Doctrine of Discovery.org. And it explains all those papal bulls, and it explains what is happening to them. And on top of that, if you can look on YouTube for a man named Steve Newcomb, who is actually probably the foremost authority on the Doctrine of Discovery. He's a Lenape he lives in California now, he's a lawyer. And also, if you get a chance, listen to Oren Lyons. They both talk about the Doctrine of Discovery. But it still has not been rescinded. Many people have been after the papacy to rescind that Doctrine of Discovery. But of course, the governments and the countries, many countries don't want that rescinded, because what it does is people will realize that these countries are living, and the citizens of these countries are living on stolen lands. And it's not just Canada, it's the United States, it's Australia, it's New Zealand, it's Africa, it's so many countries, the West Indies, the Pacific Islands. Yeah, a book, he has that book, yeah, Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding Doctrine of Discovery. But if you can, there is a wonderful film that he did, and it's directed by Sheldon Wolfchild and narrated by Buffy St. Marie, and that the name of it is The Doctrine of Discovery. So if you can, yes, please take a look at that Doctrine of Discovery, because that's where everything started. And that was that Doctrine of Discovery. Those are the, that's also the basis of racism and hate against our people, and even and against the people of Africa, which legitimized slavery and theft. Thank you.
Well, yeah, Jane, for sharing that. At the time, I had learned some things from one of my university classes, on the Papal Bowls, and, but a couple of years ago, I got to sit on a panel with Stephen's daughter. And I had no clue who Stephen Newcomb was at all. Like, I had no clue of the work he's done, or, I got to watch some of and I believe that they had showcased that movie that Jane was talking about, but I had no clue who he was. And it was only after I realized, and I was like, whoa, this man, we had that opportunity to sit with him and his daughter and to learn from them. And it's a really good thing to learn. Like, it's, if we break these down and really go to the root of it, you get to begin to understand, that reasoning and why things are the way that they are today. Like that very mindset is still well alive, within Turtle Island, So thank you so much, Jane, for bringing
I
that
knew
up.
who he was when we met him. And I just he is one of my heroes. Him and Oren Lyons, if there are heroes, they're my two favorite heroes.
Oh my, now I'm just like, oh man, I was like, I had the bestest opportunity and I didn't realize.
I sat with them and I spent as much time with them as I could.
Oh my goodness. Hey, so I think we're coming up to that last 10 minutes, and I think we may have enough time if our panelists would like to entertain this last question. And I think it's a favorite one of mine too. It's so Sheena Cameron had, she had joined a little bit later, but she had wanted to see if any of our panelists had wanted to comment on the concept of land back and the physical decolonizing of the land.
It's a very controversial concept because, and I put in the chat, the Yellowhead Institute, because they have a whole report called Land Back, and I participated in some of the workshops, and we call it the red paper, and it's a little bit of both, I would say, and I'm no expert on this, but I will say this. Let me put it this way. When that concept of land back was first introduced, you could see this fragility, this Canadian settler fragility. Oh my heavens, we're going to lose our houses, we're going to lose our land, we're going to lose our, this very property oriented thing of how we've been trained about land and water, that we own property, that we and then we can dominate over nature and so forth. But I really encourage you to read that red paper more in depth, because it is much, yes, we have communities that are running out of actual physical land. But we also have, when I think about decolonizing the land, this goes back to speaking about those respectful relationships, those interrelationships with our relatives, all relatives. And that's a difficult concept that goes against the dehumanization that Elder Jane Mearder was talking about, that goes against this corporate concept of that we exploit the natural resources, even though we do that, without even any regard of the cost and so forth. And I think it's the jurisdictional issue, and it goes back to, there was over 100 injunctions. This report, it's also on Yellowhead Institute as well, injunctions, and I think about 15% were in favor of Indigenous people, and 85% was in favor of corporations. And that's how our women are being criminalized. And so when we talk about land back, we're talking about jurisdiction over our ancestral homelands as well. And that we should be a part of that decision-making process and so forth. I don't really quite answer the question, but I think a lot of settler Canadians are saying, what do you mean? You want to take my home? And I think, no, we need to look at these broader concepts of decolonization and what does that mean? And particularly not to forget about gender and, you know, the whole issue of gender and gender diverse persons. My 2 cents worth.
I'll up the ante a little bit, Jerry. You know, putting aside the paper and you know, some of the other things that are brought up as documents that on a people-to-people basis, well, there is a kind of anomaly in people. If Canadians and Americans actually want to return land, they actually can't because of federal government policies, kind of thing, you know. So, but putting that aside, you know, this is the exact subject matter of what it takes to have a discussion together. Reconciliation is about this. It's about the relationships, and it's about all the affluence that come from what has happened in the past, what continues to happen right now. One of the, you know, and it's I'm hearing Sherry talking about, you know, well, you know, people really get defensive all of a sudden because this means that kind of thing. And this means that only because maybe 90% of North Americans don't have the slightest idea about Indigenous peoples, don't have any idea about who we are exactly, you know, don't know anything about even their own history with us, with Indian country. You know, this is a conversation that's been waiting in the wings for a long, long time. You know, and I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King he was talking about the reason why people fear each other is because they don't talk to each other, you know? And so in the absence of not talking and communicating with each other on a really heart-to-heart level, you know, then we begin to summons all the sum total of our fears and project it on people we don't even know, we don't even talk about, we don't even talk to, kind of thing. You know, so it's not about people's losing home. You know, if we talk about the basic values of Indian country, it's family, and I can't imagine any Indian person anywhere, any Indigenous peoples anywhere in this hemisphere that's ready to displace other families, you know, and to do what's been done to us, kind of that, you know. We don't hear of anybody, any of our people talking about building the big ark and sending everybody back to where they're coming from. But there is a legitimate wonder and concern about having a real fundamental gathering of our minds and hearts to figure out how are we going to live here together in peace. And in a kind of maybe esoteric sense, you know, we haven't lost the land, it's still here. And it's still here even by the dictates of Canadian law, and particularly Canadian constitutional law. You know, people are just, you know, we're occupying unceded territories. Yeah, yes, we shared territories, but we didn't share everything. You know, these are our territories, kind of thing. You know, and it really kind of reflects back to the need that we really have to come to grips with the lack of this relationship between us. And you might be really surprised that Indian people, because we're guided by some higher force, you know, creation and our relation, or even our identity is from the land, let's go back, let's try something really wild and different and really out there, like let's try friendship and peace. Let's see how that works.
Well, Gkiskedtanamoogk, Sherry, for that. I was thinking of like this question, and you guys just put it in the most beautiful way. But a couple months ago, at one of the cafes I frequent, within COVID times, I could stay in my own little bubble. But what happened was these two older non-Indigenous ladies started to kind of, pierce that bubble, but they're getting into my space, and I had kindly asked them if they could go sit somewhere. Like a table had opened up, so I asked them, and they're both French speaking, and I could see them like conversing about me, and they were just so upset, like that I had asked them. And when I came home, I was telling my family, I was like, that felt like a land back moment. Like I was writing my relations, I was, something like I was, that my space was being imposed upon. And I was like, like we got to respect that. And so, there's so many different ways people can, when it comes to their perspective of land back. And it's like the smallest little gestures could be about that, but it really brings into bigger question, how do we write our relations with one another? And I see that Sherry and Gkiskedtanamoogk both have. I feel like they want to share.
Well,
now.
I just wanted to add, I seen this what was it? Was it biodiversity? Was it an opinion? But it was by Duma Young, and talking about the Mi'kmaq concept of reconciliation. And I incorporated this into this paper about conservation that I just wrote, that you can't forgive without healing, and they both have to go hand in hand. And the problem with reconciliation I'll say state sanctioned processes is that the onus is always put on the Indigenous person to forgive without the appropriate healing and without the appropriate learning. But we're getting there. And I've written elsewhere about what I call the small T treaty relationships, sort of like what Women of Light are doing. They're just doing it. It took me a while to buy into that concept-ish, but they just kind of brought me along. And I always tell the story. My biggest shock was when I sat into a longhouse for 2 days and the women spoke and the men sat there and listened. I still can't get over that because I've always had men, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, try to silence me. And so there was something I learned from that whole situation. And so anyways, getting off topic, but I just wanted to put that this whole concept of healing, and it's not just to put us in a permanent set of victimization, but true reconciliation can only happen with healing. And as some of the elders tell us, that healing also has to go back to healing the land, restoring the land, the damage of the land, and so forth. Anyways, just something that was triggered. And my heavens, Rosalie, I can relate to that so much. Yeah, land back moment. I must remember that to describe my experience. I might do that tomorrow in a law thing I got to do. A land back moment from Rosalie.
Can I speak a little bit on reconciliation? I don't want to jump ahead of you, Gkiskedtanamoogk. No, I'll wait.
I was just going to say, boy, this sounds like social distancing to me. Welcome to Indian country.
I just want to talk a little bit about reconciliation. And when I speak about reconciliation and when I look at reconciliation, I think we need to look at it from an Indigenous perspective. And reconciliation, there's 4 parts to reconciliation. There's always the apology. And then there's 2 things that go hand in hand in the center. One is restitution and the other is forgiveness. And then with that comes reconciliation. But what I've seen the government do is they've apologized, and as Sherry said, then the onus is on us to forgive, and they call that reconciliation. What happened to restitution? And restitution doesn't mean having to throw money at things. Restitution means righting the wrongs or attempting to right those wrongs. Things like teaching the real history of Canada, not calling it Indigenous history, but Canada's history with all its ugliness. Teach that to the citizens, to the students, to the people. Let them know what the real truth is. I think that's part of restitution. And once we can find out, then we can truly say, okay, then we can truly find forgiveness and apology, a heartfelt apology, not just words, but something that comes from the heart and the spirit. And then restitution means we can walk hand in hand together for a better world for our children, for a better world for all of us. Nobody is leading us, but we walk hand in hand together with spirit, with heart, and in love. And to me, that's what restitution is. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for that. I think for me, what it really comes down to is action. What do we do, and how we do it? It matters all the most. That whole chain of events series of when we talk about this, restitution, we talk about reconciliation. It's all in the magic is all in the doing. And I'll leave it at that.
Yes, well, so much for everybody for sharing their, that wisdom. And, if Sherry or Gkiskedtanamoogk, if you have any last closing words, and then we can move on to our little closing. But if not, yeah.
I would just jump in and do your closing song, Rosalie.
Okay, it sounds good. I know my best to never overstep any of our elders, but I'll definitely take direction. So I'll get ready to. But I'm just so grateful. Thank you to everyone who has joined in. We have all had come together tonight for a reason, and a very special reason. And I just want to thank, whoever is out there, to our guides, our ancestors, for leading us to this session, so that, we can learn from one another. And I think one of the biggest things, when it comes to knowledge, oftentimes we hear that knowledge is power, but with power, with power comes that big responsibility, right? Now that what shall we do? And that brings us back to Gkiskedtanamoogk's, his last words, saying, what's going to be that action? It could be so simple as, whether it's changing your own mindset, or if it's teaching somebody else and creating that ripple effect, hearing what we've had to share with one another, and that space that we've held, and that spirit and that intent that we've held together, how can we help replicate this, into our circles? So I just want to leave that with us before we have ended our session. And I think the most appropriate song to share at this time is our humble song. And I'll just do 2 verses of that. And I think, being humble and having that humility isn't, about putting everybody else at the top and us at the bottom or anything like that. But it's like humbling ourselves to open up our minds and our hearts to this knowledge that was shared, and allow that to help carry you on into your journey. So. Get me dalam since I'm gonna do. get me dalam sesam Gkiskedtanamoogk. Oh, halam kasi Gkiskedtanamoogk na alidesnu. Música escada na alidesnu. Amush get me dalam sin Gkiskedtanamoogk. Amush get me dalam sin Gkiskedtanamoogk. Oh, halem kasi Gkiskedtanamoogk na alidesnu. Música escada na alidesnu. Música escada na alidesnu. Walalioq ak imsidnogama. Thank you all for joining and hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Rosalie. Thank you to everyone. Much, much appreciated. All right.
Perfect.
Good job, Rosalie.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is very well, and we'll chat some other time.
We will for sure. All right.
Thank you so much, Belle. Have a good night.
Good night, all.